Assalamu alaikum and a very good evening to you all. I would like to welcome you again in the introductory course on the Palestinian issue organized by the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Malaya. My name is Muslim Imran and I will be talking today in this third session of our course about the Palestinian people, Palestinian resistance, and the Palestinian political system. In the past two lectures, we discussed past Palestinian history as well as Zionism and the Zionist entity. In the first session, we discussed thoroughly how the Palestinian people settled in ancient times in Palestine and how Palestine has undergone several civilizational developments over the course of 10,000 years since the very first human settlement in Jericho. We also discussed in the second lecture how the Zionist occupation started in Palestine as early as the emergence of the idea of Zionism in Europe in the late 19th century, and how this fascist ideology spread across the Jewish communities of Europe and eventually managed to control lands in Palestine with the help of the British imperial occupation of Palestine. In today's lecture, we will discuss in details Palestinian people's history, how the Palestinians developed their communities, culture, and society in Palestine over the centuries, and how they eventually faced an ongoing occupation and colonization in their own homeland. In today's lecture, we will discuss the Palestinian people, their demographics, their resistance, as well as the Palestinian political system within which the Palestinian political life is unfolding. In this lecture, we will focus more on more recent developments in the Palestinian political system in order to better understand who the actors in the Palestinian political life and the Palestinian struggle are. If you recall, we discussed when we highlighted Zionism and the Zionist state, we discussed Israeli political parties, Israeli or Zionist militias, and political movements. We will be doing the same in the context of the Palestinian political struggle, the Palestinian resistance movements, and the Palestinian political life. Moving on to the next slide. In this course, we have highlighted earlier several points on the history of Palestine and the history of the Zionist project, and we will be discussing today some of the historical as well as the contemporary developments of the Palestinian life. In future lectures, we will be also discussing some major issues in the struggle for a free Palestine that would include the life of Palestinian refugees, Palestinian prisoners, Jerusalem and its status, the life of people in Gaza under the siege, as well as under the ongoing Israeli genocide, Israeli apartheid, and the expansion of settlement, the Palestinian issue in international law, as well as the international solidarity movement with Palestine. And finally, in the final lecture, we will be touching on the geopolitical developments since the deal of the century until the Al-Aqsa flood. Moving on, I've just highlighted what we discussed in the previous class. In today's lecture, I will highlight briefly the Palestinian history, the history of the Palestinian people, Palestinian demography, Palestinian resistance, and will delve deeper into the Palestinian political system. So, a very quick overview of our previous discussion in the first lecture about Palestine and the Palestinian people brings us to the ancient history. Maybe we can go back to the previous slide a bit. In the ancient history, Palestinian people and the communities that settled in historical Palestine have faced several um, rivaling civilizations. They also developed their very own indigenous civilization in the name of the Canaanite civilization, but they since they are located at the crossroads of civilizations, they faced several competitions between rivaling major powers of the ancient times. So Palestine was always a place of competition between the Egyptian, Babylonian, Ashurian, Persian, Roman, and other civilizations who either competed, and Palestine was a buffer zone, or competed over Palestine itself and occupied it at certain periods of time. But the Canaanite people, the people who have been settling in Palestine for thousands of years, continued to exist, sometimes form their own political institutions and governments, and sometimes exist under um, different dynasties and empires, sometimes resisting these dynasties and empires, sometimes collaborating with them, sometimes fighting among each other, sometimes cooperating against external imperial and major powers. One of the most important points of history was the agricultural revolution, when humans started to move from gatherer hunter hunter lifestyle into an agricultural settlement. One of these early transformations took place in Palestine, in the city of Jericho, which continues to be inhabited until today. Some 10,000 years ago, early communities settled in Palestine and started developing continuous life. Now, these ancient peoples are, of course, still subject of historical uh, studies, excavations, and theories, but most probably they were part of the migrating communities within the zone of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilizations, who have been moving looking for water sources, uh, agricultural produce, and other necessary resources for human life. The most significant development since the Jericho settlement was the establishment of a Canaanite civilization in the land of Palestine. In about the third millennia BC, Semitic people started to migrate and settle in Palestine. Amongst these many Semitic communities, of course, the Canaanites, who gave the name to the land and who developed the earliest culture and civilization, moved at about the year 2500 BC. Other Semitic communities also started to follow suit. Other Canaanite communities, like the Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites, moved some uh, thousand years after the earliest Canaanite Semitic migrations to Palestine. Of course, other Semitic Arab communities migrated to the same region from the Arabian Peninsula and from the northern parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And one of the earliest peoples and civilizations to set up its own state there was the Nabateans, who developed Petra city in that exists today in Jordan at about 500 BC. The Nabateans had a long dynasty of few hundred years until the Romans came and took over the whole land of Palestine. But in the first millennia, in the first millennium BC, many other Arab communities moved into Palestine to join other Semitic peoples like the Canaanites, Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, and others. And these included many Yemeni tribes from the Arabian Arabs, Al-Arab, Al-Ariba. One of these notable communities was the one that established the Ghassanid dynasty in Palestine at about the at about 150 years before Christ. The first Ghassanid king was Harith I, who established the dynasty in about 169 BC, and this Ghassanid dynasty lasted for a few hundred years between two other political regimes, which were the Nabateans in the south around Petra, and the Palmyra community in the north around Damascus. So there were, at one point of time, before the time of Jesus Christ, there were three different Arab states around the area of Palestine, north, center, and south of Palestine. Of course, one of the early communities that was not Semitic, most probably was not Semitic, but moved to Palestine at about 1200 BC was the Pelist people, who came from the Aegean Sea, somewhere in western Turkey today, and settled in the coastal area of Palestine near Gaza. Eventually, they merged with the other Semitic people and lost their original languages and became Semitic speaking themselves. But when the Romans conquered Palestine in later times, they took this specific name to name the land of Canaan, or the Canaanite region, into Philistine, or Palestia, or Palestine. So over the course of few thousands of years, two major names were used for Palestine. One was the land of Canaan, the other one was Palestine itself. And in historical documents and religious scriptures, we see these two different names being used from time to time. Now, the Israelite people, the Israelites who followed Prophet Moses from Egypt to Palestine at about the year 1230 BC, mixed with other Canaanite communities. They established a political regime themselves in the north eastern parts of Palestine. They established a state that would probably be called Israel back then, that lasted until 721 BC, when the state of Israel collapsed, and many of the 12 Israelite tribes migrated out of Palestine, and other Israelite tribes started conflict amongst each other and with their neighbors. Eventually, the Babylonians forced out many of the remaining Jews in Palestine at about 597 BC, in what was later dubbed as the Babylonian expulsion. The Persians who succeeded the Babylonians sent back some of these Jews, but practically the Jewish Israelite presence in the land of Canaan started to decline around this era. So before Christ, few hundred years before Christ, one Jewish dynasty existed under and some sort of autonomous rule in Palestine under the name of the Maccabi dynasty from about 164 to 37 BC. But Jewish political life started to decline, and eventually Jewish presence in Palestine after the Jesus the Christ and the Roman Byzantine rule started to diminish. By 135 AD, many of the Jewish communities moved out of Palestine or converted to Christianity and other religions. And since that second century after the Christ, all the way until the year 1880, Jewish presence in Palestine was very minimal and very symbolic. In the year 1880, before the start of the major waves of Zionist migration to Palestine, the total number of Jews could be estimated at 23,000 Jews. Most of them were in a way or another considered Palestinian Jews. In the year 1918, when the British took over Palestine and facilitated Jewish migration, the majority was still Palestinian Arab. In 1918, there were some 665,000 Palestinian or residents of Palestine. Of these 665,000, 550,000 were Palestinian Muslims, 60,000 were Palestinian Christians, and 55,000 were Jews. be it Palestinian Jews or newly migrant Jews over the past 40 years. But whatever the numbers of this Jewish community was, more than 91% of the population of Palestine was still Palestinian when the British occupation started. Over the years of the British mandate or British occupation of Palestine, the Jewish migration was on the rise. And over 30 years of migration resulted in about 33% of the population of historical Palestine to become a Jewish population. In this case, most of them were Zionist Jews who believed in the Zionist ideology and picked up arms to take over Palestine by force. Palestinian Arabs, of course, resisted this, but the British designs facilitated the takeover of Palestine. When Nakba took place in 1947 and 1948, as we discussed in our previous lecture, more than 900,000 Palestinians were expelled out of their homelands in Palestine. So we're talking about 2/3 of the Palestinian people, who were at about 1.2 million Palestinians up to 1.4 million Palestinians. 900,000 of these people were expelled out of Palestine and became refugees. In 1967, more Palestinians were expelled when Israel expanded its territories and conquered the rest of Palestine. About 330,000 Palestinians became refugees. As we speak, the number of Palestinian refugees is in the millions, and most probably more than 50% of the Palestinian people are actually refugees who live outside Palestine, while the other 50% are Palestinians inside Palestine, whether inside Israel or the West Bank or Gaza, or internally displaced in these territories. Now, a quick recap of the Palestinian history brings us to an important point of time called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was a British political promise to the Jewish people, to the Zionist people in 1917. In the next slide, you see the Balfour Declaration promising the Palestinian land to non-existent Jewish population in Palestine. The Jews were still outside Palestine when the British took over Palestine. In the next slide, we see that the Jewish population in Palestine was very minimal, and it started to grow significantly over the 30 years of British occupation of Palestine. In the next slide, we see that the UN, United Nations, decided to partition Palestine as a final solution for the British-created problem. The British came over, created a problem, and started to devise solutions. So the United Nations suggested a partition plan in which Arabs get only 45% of their own land, while the Jewish immigrant settlers get 55% of the Palestinian land. And interestingly, the population of this Jewish state is actually 50-50, 50% Palestinian, 50% Arab. While the population of the Arab state is almost 95% or more Palestinian. Meanwhile, Jerusalem was supposed to be placed under international administration with about 100,000 Arabs and 100,000 Jews living in that holy city. So this partition plan, of course, created the political tool that facilitated the establishment of the Israeli state and the Zionist regime in 1948. Okay, in the next slide, I hope Mustafa will stay alert with us because I have no control over the slides in today's lecture. Probably the size of the slides is beyond upload. Jerusalem was declared a separate entity. Next. But the Zionist militias had a different opinion, and they started Nakba, what the Palestinians call Nakba, and what Israel calls the War of Independence. It was another phase of ethnic cleansing and genocide, not very different from what's happening now in Gaza that you can see actually in social media outlets. The Zionist militias started a war of aggression over the Palestinian communities who were mostly unarmed because of the British restrictions on Palestinian resistance. So for more than 1 year, the Zionist militias committed massacres, horror, and terror, and forced out hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Palestine. In the next slide, we see that the Palestinians remained in diaspora and had no political institution to run their affairs until earlier the PLO was established in Jerusalem and later moved to the diaspora after the occupation of Jerusalem. Then the PLO decided to sign a peace agreement with Israel, hoping that they will establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, which are about 20% of the Palestinian land. The Oslo Accord is the most significant political document signed by the PLO and the government of Israel, but we all know today, 30 years after the Oslo Accord, that it was a failure. The Palestinians were promised illusion by the Zionist regimes, the Zionist governments and the regime, and eventually they were unable to establish an independent Palestinian state. They were cut into small pieces that are not different from ghettos or Bantustans as what existed in apartheid South Africa. Now, in the next slide, we see that Israel expanded its settlements, making Palestinian life very difficult. If you are from Hebron and you want to go to Ramallah, which is only a few kilometers away, you need to go through so many checkpoints. If you are the president of the state of Palestine who lives in Ramallah, you need to get a permit from Israel to travel outside your own state. Okay, in the next slide, we see Israel imposing different restrictions on different Palestinians. In the West Bank, they expand settlements and steal land. In Gaza, they impose a blockade, and they have practically created the largest open-air prison in the world today. It is not very different from concentration camps, where 2 million Palestinians are, during this war now, practically and literally starved to death. The Israeli administration has imposed all sorts of restrictions on Gaza over the last 17 years, but in the last 3 months, they took it to the next level and started implementing policies of genocide, cutting off water supply, electric supply, of course, communication and internet, as well as blockade over any goods or services coming into Gaza, blockade that doesn't allow patients, the tens of thousands of the injured Palestinians, to go out of Gaza for medical treatment. Okay, in the next slide, we see where Palestinian people live today. There are Palestinians practically everywhere. If you check in your own country, wherever you are watching this video from, I assure you there are some Palestinians who live there. They are either refugees, expatriates, or passers-by. In Arab countries, about 6.5 million Palestinians live as refugees, mostly in neighboring countries like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. But there is also a sizable community in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. Inside Palestine, in the regime called Israel, there are about 1.5 to 1.7 million Palestinians. These are Palestinian Muslim, Christian, and Druze who live under Israeli rules and who hold Israeli citizenship and passports. In Gaza, there are about 2.3 million Palestinians who are either original citizens of Gaza, whose grandfathers and ancestors have been living in Gaza, or are refugees who were forced out of their homelands in 1947, 1948 and moved into Gaza. 2/3 of the population of Gaza are refugees from other Palestinian lands. In the West Bank, there is a bigger chunk of Palestinians. About 3.25 million Palestinians live under military occupation and face daily apartheid policies by the Israeli regime. They also have to deal with almost 1 million illegal Israeli settlers who daily steal their land, commit terrorist attacks against them, including burning babies like Muhammad Abu Khdir and Dababshi and others, or create difficulty for the Palestinians to live a normal, peaceful life. Of course, in other places, there are other smaller communities, in Europe and North America, there are up to 500,000 Palestinians who continue to live there over the decades. In South America, there is also a large community of Latin Americans from Palestinian origin, mostly in Chile, Brazil, and other Latin American countries. Okay. Since we highlighted Palestinian history in brief and we discussed the demographics of the Palestinians, it is important to note that the Palestinian people did not accept the Israeli and Zionist onslaught on Palestine. They resisted by all means available at their disposal. As early as 1917, when the British took over Palestine, the Palestinians started to mull resistance. But in the early days of the British Mandate or British occupation, Palestinians opted to take peaceful measures like civil disobedience and protests. So in 1920, there were protests by the Palestinians against the British policy of facilitating migration of Zionists into Palestine and facilitating the establishment of a Zionist homeland in Palestine for the Jews. When the British continued in their unfair policies against the Palestinians, and the Jewish migrant community started to cause havoc and attempt to interfere in life in Jerusalem and to trespass the holy city of Jerusalem, in 1929, Palestinians revolted and Al-Buraq revolution took place. A conflict ensued between Arabs and the Jewish migrant community, as well as the British authorities, which resulted in the death of hundreds. The Palestinians signaled to the British authorities that they are not going to sit idle while their land is being stolen by the Zionist militias and the Zionist community. They were willing to talk peace, they were willing to negotiate with the British, they were demanding political rights, including self-determination and a self-government, but they were not going to accept the loss of their land to the Zionist settlers, and therefore in 1929 they started this early revolution. Of course, the British had to adjust their policies temporarily, but eventually in the 1930s, the British continued facilitating Jewish migration into Palestine. In 1935, a new group of armed resistance led by Syrian ulama cleric Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, who was based in Haifa and was exiled from French-occupied Syria, a new group started and struggled to resist against the British occupation. Izzuddin al-Qassam himself was assassinated in 1935 in Jenin, in the northern part of the West Bank, but his colleagues and comrades continued the revolution from that year onwards, and in the 3 years that followed, 1936 until 1939, a serious Palestinian revolution took place where Palestinian resistance groups took over control of rural parts of Palestine, and the British had to expand their military presence in Palestine to more than 100,000 soldiers around this period. Thousands of Palestinians were killed. However, Palestinian resistance continued demanding political rights, freedom, self-determination, and the end of Zionist immigration into Palestine. The British had to adjust their policy temporarily, but when the Second World War started in 1939, the British had a change of policy, and of course they imposed emergency rule. The Palestinians had more difficult time. Their political leadership was sent into exile, and they were banned from any sort of political organization or military organization. Meanwhile, the Israeli Zionist militias served in the British Army during the Second World War and were empowered, of course, at the end of the Second World War to take over Palestine through military force. So the British decided by 1947 to hand over the issue of Palestine to the United Nations and leave it altogether. In 1948, the Zionist militias, which were working hard for 30 years in occupied British-occupied Palestine, took this opportunity once the United Nations decided to partition Palestine and called for an independent Jewish state and started their onslaught on the Palestinians, committing a genocide against the Palestinians in different Palestinian cities and towns. More than 500 Palestinian cities and villages were destroyed in this process of ethnic cleansing, well documented by many historians, including Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, Palestinian historian Noor Masalha, Salman Abu Sittah, and others. The Nakba that took place in 1947-1948 saw millions of Palestinians facing a new reality. Almost 1 million were forced into exile. Hundreds of thousands were placed under military rule of Israel, and hundreds of thousands of others became part of either the Jordanian or the Egyptian administration in the West Bank and Gaza, respectively. However, the Palestinians resisted in 1947 and 1948 itself. As Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian military battalion during this war, resisted until the last bullet, and he himself was killed in Al-Qastal military encounter near Jerusalem. And there is a document signed by his own hand telling the Arab League, the newly formed Arab League, you have failed us. We needed only some weapons and you did not deliver. Stories of the Arab League and the Arab governments failing the Palestinians, unfortunately, continued to be repeated again and again since 1948. In 1965, the Palestinians who became refugees in the diaspora launched the Great Palestinian Revolution, another major revolution by the Palestinians, but this time around from the diaspora. The refugees who were exiled from Palestine in 1947-1948 regrouped themselves, organized themselves politically, and formed several institutions, including resistance groups like Fatah and others. And they launched a campaign of resistance activities since 1965. In 1968, the Palestinian resistance groups, alongside the Jordanian army, successfully defeated the Israeli invasion of Jordan. An operation that the Israelis initiated failed in thwarting Palestinian resistance. Although in 1967, of course, the Jordanians and the Palestinians lost the West Bank to the Israeli occupation, but resistance was still meaningful and significant in 1968. In 1973, Palestinian Fidaiyin and resistance fighters joined Arab states, especially Syria and Egypt, in resisting Israeli occupation. And in 1978, Palestinian resistance based in Lebanon resisted Israeli invasion of Lebanon. 1982, the Palestinian resistance stood for months against the Israeli invasion of the Lebanese capital, Beirut, until their leadership was exiled from Beirut. In 1987, the Palestinians started a new wave of resistance, but this time a civil, unarmed resistance inside the West Bank and Gaza that was dubbed later the Palestinian Intifada. The first Intifada was successful in pressuring Israel, but eventually led to an unsuccessful political settlement, which is the Oslo Accord in 1993. In 2000, because of the failure of the political settlement and the failure of the Oslo Accord, Palestinians started a second Intifada that lasted for several years. Israel, over these following years, started to restrict the Palestinian life and to think of policies of divide and rule. In 2005, because of the pressure of the Intifada and the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, Israel pulled out of Gaza, but practically isolated Gaza from the West Bank and started a series of military attacks on Gaza, starting with 2006, then 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, 2021, and the most recent genocidal campaign that we saw in 2023 that continues up until today on the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. However, in spite of all these Israeli atrocities, we can see from this history that I have just outlined, and from the ongoing struggle in Gaza that the Palestinians have not given up and are still willing to resist Israeli occupation. Next. Okay. In this final part of my presentation, I will be discussing the Palestinian political system. In previous sessions, this particular topic took one whole lecture, but today we needed to highlight some relevant topics, and therefore we started with the discussion on the Palestinian people, their history, and the Palestinian demography and Palestinian resistance. Now, in the remaining part of this lecture, we will discuss the Palestinian political system. And by a political system or a political order, I mean something that, in a way or another, Fukuyama, the American philosopher and political scientist, devised the set of political institutions which define the state, manage the rule of law, and struggle with democratic accountability. So, inspired by this definition by this important political scientist, I look into the Palestinian political life with these lenses, but I recognize that the Palestinian people do not have an independent state yet. Therefore, the focus is actually not on democratic accountability or on the political life within an independent state, but rather on the Palestinian political actors and the dynamics of their exchanges and interactions. So, political system in this coming presentation will mean a set of political institutions or political arenas in which political actors interact and or compete to shape a political order. So this is the Palestinian political system that I'm going to outline in the coming slides. Defining the Palestinian political system requires us to look into the actors. The actors are either institutions or political groups and vehicles. Institutions would naturally include government institutions, political institutions, and other actors would include political parties, resistance movements in the case of Palestine, religious institutions, NGOs, other civil society groups, and other institutions. Each period of the Palestinian political history has seen various actors and institutions and had its own unique characteristics and specific motives for struggle. Mustafa, if I stop, please proceed to the next slide. Looking into the factors that shaped Palestinian political life in order to understand the Palestinian political system require us to think of external and internal factors. External factors would naturally be geopolitical developments, such as the changes in regional or related global orders. Internal factors would include political developments, domestic political developments, such as the changes in the Palestinian struggle, including the competition over leadership in the Palestinian society. Other internal factors include socio-economic developments, like the changes in the levels of economic well-being of the Palestinians and the social results attached to that. Other internal factors include demographic, socio-cultural developments, such as the changes in Palestinian demographics according to age, gender, religion, tribe, clan, culture, or other developments. So, in our presentation of the Palestinian political system, we will discuss the development of this system chronologically over the years, but we will always be looking at the actors and the factors, the context, and what motivated the development and the shaping of the system. In this layout, I divide the Palestinian political history into several stages. One is the pre-mandate era, the pre-British era, under the different Islamic dynasties, the most recent being the Ottoman. Another in which the political institutions started to see the light of day is the British Mandate period, starting in 1917 all the way until the Partition Plan and the Nakba in 1947. The next is the post-Nakba period, in which the Palestinians were practically lost and their political life was in mess and in disarray because they eventually became refugees. You can imagine having one political community, one community, which faces genocide, and suddenly 2/3 of this community becomes refugee in so many different countries. So we will look into this period. We will also look into the PLO period, the years that followed the establishment of the main Palestinian political institution, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in 1964. And we can actually, in one way, say that everything since 1964 is a part of one political order shaped by the PLO. However, because of the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, the Oslo Accord, and the shift in Palestinian leadership that followed, I think it's more practical to say that the PLO period before the Oslo Accord is one phase, and the Palestinian Authority period in the post Oslo Accord is another phase. And this one itself can also be categorized into different phases depending on the political establishment and the political actors active. Finally, I assume that the ongoing developments that started with the deal of the century and is now unfolding in the form of the Al-Aqsa flood and the ongoing genocide in Gaza, I suppose that these developments will shape a new phase of the Palestinian political life and political history, which is probably the post-PA period. In order to understand the political life of a community, it's important to look into their most recent history as well as their contemporary history. The Palestinian people have lived under the Ottoman Empire for almost 4 centuries. Throughout these 4 centuries, administrative, political, and cultural life were shaped by the main political regime under which the Palestinians lived, and this regime was the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultanate, you name it, whatever you like to name it, was the main political institution in which Palestinian political, cultural, and economic life unfolded. The Ottomans had Jerusalem as a central region in their own empire. Of course, the Palestinian land has, since the advent of Islamic rule in the 7th century AD, been run under different Islamic dynasties, the Rashidun, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Ayyubids, the Mamlukids, the Ottomans. And throughout all of these eras, the Palestinian people lived under different administrations. Sometimes all of Palestine, historical Palestine or land of Canaan, was under one administrative entity. Sometimes they were scattered across 2 or 3 different administrative entities. So during the time of the Rashidun conquest of Palestine, during the time of Umar al-Khattab, Palestine was part of what was called Jund Palestine. Eventually, in later years, during the Umayyad time, the center of power moved from Medina to Damascus. So Palestine became adjacent to the center of political power in Damascus, and many of the Umayyad caliphs and rulers used Palestinian lands as a place for holidaying. Actually, interestingly, they also developed Al Masjid Al Aqsa, and the architecture that you see today of Al Masjid Al Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock has emerged actually during the Umayyad period. But it was not, Palestine was not an independent autonomous territory under them. It continued to be part of larger entities, mainly in Damascus. In the Abbasid period, the center of power moved to Baghdad in today's Iraq, and Palestine saw an earthquake during this period. So its political importance has probably declined a bit, but it remained as a center of religious importance because of Masjid al-Aqsa and the other sanctuaries for other divine religions. In the later period, Palestine itself became the center of contest and clashes between the Islamic civilization and the European Crusade civilizations. In the later Abbasid period, when the central government declined in power, the Crusades conquered parts of Palestine, and the rising Zinki and then Ayyubid dynasties facilitated the liberation of Palestine and the establishment of a central government that spanned the regions of Egypt and Greater Syria, including Palestine. But eventually, in spite of the rising political importance of this new entity, differences between the different sultans and internal clashes led to the collapse of these dynasties and the rise of the Mamlukid dynasty. Eventually, the Ottomans, who were a rising star in the east, crushed the Mamlukid dynasty, and since the year 1516, I think in Marj Dabiq encounter, took over rule of Palestine and most of the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt. When the Ottomans came in, they established their own institutions. In the later 18th century, they started certain administrative reforms. They built a lot of new architectural monuments in Palestine itself, especially in Jerusalem and its neighboring regions. But in the late 19th century, through Tanzimat and other administrative reforms, Jerusalem started to become the center of political relevance in Palestine, and the identity of Palestine, which for centuries revolved around Jerusalem, started to emerge politically during this period. So when the Ottoman Parliament was established after the political reforms, the representatives of Jerusalem represented basically Palestine and Jerusalem in the Ottoman Parliament. There were two members of the Ottoman Parliament from Jerusalem, or what was called Al-Mab'uthan, in Istanbul, and the administration of Jerusalem, in a way or another, was placed directly under the Sultan in Istanbul. When the Ottomans collapsed and their rule over Palestine ended, the British adopted most of their administrative arrangements and division of Palestine. So land laws, inheritance laws, and many other relevant administrative laws that continue even today in Palestine were actually put in place during the Ottoman period. The British adopted many of them, and the Israeli regime, which took over Palestine, adopted some of them, including even the terminology used in division of land, for instance, dunum rather than acres, and so on. Under the British mandate, for 30 years, the British denied Palestinians the establishment of self-rule or a self-government. And the Palestinians were really upset about this because the Palestinian people, even in the early years of the 20th century, saw themselves as a developed nation, culturally, economically, as well as politically. I mentioned that they had representatives in the Ottoman Parliament, for instance. Economically, Palestine used to export oranges and other agricultural produce to the rest of the world, including Europe, from the 19th century onward. The Palestinian communities in Palestine were quite educated compared to the rest of the region and the rest of the world. Interestingly, the Palestinians were amongst the earliest Arab citizens to actually acquire doctorates in the early 20th century. Literacy rate was also quite high in Palestine. So when the British refused to allow Palestinians to have elections and self-rule, the Palestinians were very upset about it. The urban elites established political parties in the 1920s, in the early 1920s, including, for instance, in the next slide you see, including the political parties like the Independence Party of Palestine, حزب الاستقلال, the National Defense Party, حزب الدفاع الوطني, the Palestinian Arab Party, الحزب العربي الفلسطيني. And you see the urban elite was split mostly not across ideological fault lines, but across clan competition, especially the urban elite in Jerusalem. Families like Al-Husseini and Nashashibi and others were competing. However, these Palestinians had political parties as early as the 20s and the 30s and thought that through political organization they can actually get some political rights from the British. The British denied the Palestinians any significant political rights and instead allowed some religious institutions and figures to lead the Palestinians. So the Supreme Muslim Council was established in the early 20s. Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was appointed Mufti of Palestine, took the political leadership, and the Palestinian Muslim and Christian communities formed the High Arab Committee, later the High Arab Commission, to lead the Palestinian political struggle throughout the 30s and the 40s. And Haj Amin al-Husseini was the figurehead of this institution. This political institution for all these years included Muslim and Christian Palestinian community leaders and organizations. Within Palestine, different ideologies were competing, including Islamist Muslim Brotherhood ideology. The Muslim Brotherhood was one of the earliest groups to set up actually branches in Palestine. Communist ideology. The Palestinians had in the early days communist parties after the Bolshevik Revolution, in addition to Arab nationalist ideology, which was manifested during the early times with the Hashemite revolution, but later in the 50s and the 60s with other Arab nationalist movements. The Palestinians themselves formed one of the earliest Arab nationalist movements that we will talk about in the following slides. Going back to the previous slide, we see that the main actors in this phase of the Palestinian political life was the British Mandate government, but Palestinian political parties, resistance movements like Azzdin al-Qassam's movement and others, and the High Arab Committee led by Haj Amin al-Husseini were among the other important actors trying to struggle for a Palestinian independent state. On the other side, there were Zionist militias like the Haganah, Stern, Irgun, and others, and there were Zionist political institutions like the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, and others that were competing with the Palestinians and working actually hand in hand with the British Mandate government to steal Palestine from the Palestinians. The most significant development was the Second World War, that of course led, maybe back to the first slide, the Second World War, which led to the end of this phase. So this phase started with the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, after which the Balfour Declaration and other developments ensued. It ended with the Second World War and Nakba, or the Zionist takeover of Palestine. Okay, moving on. After the British Mandate period, which ended with Nakba, a new phase of Palestinian political life emerged. And this was probably the most difficult phase of our political history. Even today's phase, with all these genocidal wars on Gaza, atrocities in the West Bank, Israeli restrictions and apartheid, I think the period after Nakba was worse, because the Palestinians were lost. For 2 decades, the Palestinian people were just lost. They did not know what to do, where to go, how to organize. They lost their land, they lost their properties, they lost their wealth, and they were pushed over from one Arab regime to the other, because Arab governments themselves were newly independent states. Their armies were ill-equipped, ill-trained. The nations were poor, impoverished. The foreign domination was still very high. So the Palestinians were refugees, lost in refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, and elsewhere. However, there were still some attempts by the Palestinians to organize politically, because if you don't have political organizations, you cannot achieve political goals. That's actually important. So the Palestinians, having known that and having tried very early on, since the 1920s, realized that they have to come up with some solution. So in the post-Nakba years, the Israeli occupation became the main actor, because they were the political institution that controlled the Palestinians, or most of the Palestinians. However, the Jordanian and Egyptian administrations of the West Bank and Gaza, respectively, were also important political institutions within which the Palestinian political life unfolded. The All Palestine government that was established by the High Arab Commission under the premiership of Ahmad Hilmi Abdel Baqi was there, but had no significant influence whatsoever. All they could do was to raise the Palestinian flag in Gaza, but eventually they themselves were forced out by the Egyptians to move to an office in Cairo. The Arab League, which was established in 1945, became one of the important political institutions regionally that deliberated on the matters of the Palestinians. So the Palestinians were not left alone to decide on their own future. The Arab League was one of the regional players that participated in this decision-making process. And of course, the new Palestinian political groups, especially those that had some earlier manifestations inside Palestine, like the Muslim Brotherhood, the communists, and the nationalists, started to participate in public life. Looking at the factors that shaped, looking at the actors, I have mentioned most of them just now. We see that the main political movements that emerged in this period in Palestine, besides the ones that existed but were shattered because of Nakba, was number one, the Arab nationalist movement, or Harakat al-Qawmiyin al-Arab, led by Dr. George Habash, a Palestinian Christian socialist leader. This Arab nationalist movement was the mother organization after which the Palestinian Popular Front emerged, but from which also several Arab socialist parties and movements emerged and came to power actually in countries like Yemen, Iraq, and other countries. Another important political actor that emerged in this early period was Hizb ut-Tahrir, by a Palestinian scholar and political activist, Taqiyuddin Nabhani. In the early years, Hizb ut-Tahrir decided to join the political process in Jordan, in the Kingdom of Jordan, because the West Bank was under the administration of the Jordanians. They joined the parliamentary elections, but eventually the ideas of Hizb al-Tahrir did not really fit well with a democratic layout, and they decided to boycott elections in later years and move into becoming a transnational political group. Until today, Hizb Tahrir continues to exist in Palestine, and it has actually many followers in many Palestinian cities, mainly in the West Bank, the birthplace of the movement. So in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s, Israel was the main political institution within which the Palestinians were denied any form of political organization. Jordan was running the West Bank and allowed some sort of political organization. So groups like the Arab Nationalist Movement, Hizb Tahrir, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and others existed during this period. In Egyptian administered Gaza, political life was very minimal because if we recall, in the 50s and 60s, Gamal Abdel Nasser took over power, and his nationalist, Arab nationalist regime controlled political life, and it was more or less a one-party system. So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza were banned, and other political groups were in the hiding. So the Palestinian political life was really, really difficult. However, over the next decade, in the 1960s, the Palestinians and some of their Arab neighbors started to think of new ways to organize the Palestinians and to resist Israeli occupation. One of them was forming new resistance movements like Fatah, which emerged in 1959. Another way was the establishment of the PLO in 1964. So in the next slide, we see that the most significant Palestinian political institution was established in 1964 after an important conference that actually took place in East Jerusalem, which was still under Jordanian administration. We know that Jerusalem fell to Israeli occupation in 1967 when Israel occupied the West Bank from Jordan. So in 1964, a national conference was held in Jerusalem with the help, of course, of some Arab governments like the Jordanian government. A Palestinian Saudi diplomat in the name of Ahmed Shuqairi was elected to lead this new political institution called the Palestine Liberation Organization. The role of this political institution was to lead the Palestinians to liberate Palestine. However, many political movements and most notably resistance groups within the Palestinian context refused in the early days to work within the PLO framework. Groups like Fatah, for instance, decided to wage their own revolution against Israel from outside the folds of the PLO. In 1967, when Arabs were defeated in this six-day war, the PLO was under pressure to change its leadership and to include Palestinian political and resistance groups into their folds. So Ahmed Shuqairi resigned. Eventually, Fatah took over the leadership of the PLO, and the Arab world, later on the United Nations, recognized the PLO as the main political representative of the Palestinians. Throughout the following decades, the Palestinians resisted Israel through the PLO and the Palestinian factions, but had to face a lot of difficulties and pressure from different Arab governments. So the PLO leadership was expelled several times from different Arab countries, including in 1970, the expulsion from Jordan, in 1982, the expulsion, but this time around by the Israelis from Beirut, and its political activities were scattered across the Arab world all the way until the first Intifada in 1987-1988 started. When the first Intifada started, it was very clear that the center of power was going to shift from the diaspora to inside occupied Palestine. From 1948 all the way until 1994, a lot of Palestinian political life, political developments were actually shaped in the diaspora and were decided in the different Palestinian refugee centers in different Arab countries. But after the first Intifada in 1987, 1988, the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza started at first a civil disobedience, but later a militant resistance revolution against the Israeli occupation, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization supported this intifada and eventually decided to actually negotiate with Israel some sort of political settlement, upon which a Palestinian state was supposed to be established in the late 1990s. But Israel failed to deliver upon its promises to the PLO. So the next phase was the phase of the Palestinian Authority. Next. Okay. So that I don't miss out, back to the previous slide. Several Palestinian factions emerged in this period of the PLO. Most notably, of course, is Fatah, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement in 1959, but in the 1960s it became more instrumental. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is now the second largest party within the PLO, is an offshoot of the Harakat al-Qawmiyin al-Arab that was formed by Dr. George Habash. It's a socialist resistance group. One of the splinter groups from the PFLP is actually the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by Naif Hawatmeh, a Jordanian Christian leader who leads this important Palestinian political faction. Other splinter groups like the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, General Command, also split from the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. In the later years, Islamic movements started to emerge and organize politically and militarily. So the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, led by Fath al-Shiqaqi, started in 1981. Later, the Islamic resistance movement Hamas, which was one of the newest manifestations of the groups of political Islam represented in the early days of the 20th century in Palestine as the Muslim Brotherhood, emerged in the late 80s as the Hamas movement. So moving to the same period in the 1960s, the PLO was established after an important conference called the Palestinian National Conference, upon which the Palestinian National Council was established. The PNC is theoretically the parliament of the Palestinian people. It was established in order to legislate and oversee laws for the Palestinian Revolution and the PLO, and to oversee the activities of the executive bodies of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Other than the PNC, the PLO is the one that you see here. It still, of course, maintains the goal of liberating Palestine. You see the map of historical Palestine is still there on the logo. However, its charter was altered and adjusted in the 1990s to accommodate the peace process and the political settlement that was led by the late Yasser Arafat in order to achieve an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza upon the two-state solution proposals. Okay, these are some of the PLO member factions. Okay, next. Several institutions were built upon the PLO structure. We mentioned the earliest was the PNC, Palestinian National Council. It's the parliament. the Palestinian Central Council, which is a reduced parliament of about 100 to 124 members. It oversees the activities of the executive committee, seen in the next slide. The executive committee is led by the president of Palestine and the chairman of the PLO, who is now also the president of Fatah, Dr. Mahmoud Abbas, and is supposed to represent all the PLO factions. But in recent years, because of the authoritarian tendencies of President Abbas, many of the PLO member factions opted to stay out of the PLO executive committee. Okay, so the PLO executive committee is more or less the Palestinian government inside and outside Palestine. But because in the diaspora it was weakened significantly after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority inside the West Bank and Gaza, the PLO started to become more or less a shadow Palestinian government in the diaspora that had no powers. Other factions that emerged in the 1980s and later in the 2000s started to compete even with the PLO itself. Islamic groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, as well as several other smaller factions, refused to join the PLO because they believed that, number one, the PLO leadership under Fatah committed a big mistake in signing the Oslo Accord and accepting to actually limit the Palestinian struggle to only the liberation of the West Bank and Gaza. Number two, because of the way the PLO was managed by Fatah and its leadership, these factions felt that they would rather continue their struggle from outside the folds of the PLO. But since 2005, a lot of efforts have been put to reconcile the different Palestinian factions and to bring together all of these factions under the folds of a reformed PLO leadership. So far, this has not succeeded, but efforts are still being put in place. In recent years, over the last 20 years, the Palestinian Authority emerged and a new phase of our political history saw the light of day. In the next slide, you see the main actors that shape Palestinian political life under the current period. Of course, the Israeli occupation continues to be one of the main external actors, factors, and institutions imposing restrictions on Palestinian life and creating the bounds of how our political dynamics should unfold. But Palestinian groups and factions continue also to play their role in resisting this Israeli occupation. PLO factions like Fatah and Popular Front and others continue to play a role. Resistance factions from outside the PLO like Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, as well as many other Islamic resistance groups, especially in Gaza and in diaspora, continue to also play a role in resisting Israeli occupation. The Popular Front, which is supposedly a PLO member, in this period rejected the Oslo Accord and the two states solution, and therefore became a PLO member that is against the PLO policies. Other political forces that emerged after the 2006 elections included some political groups that did not engage in armed resistance like almost every other Palestinian faction. These would include groups like the National Initiative led now by Dr. Mustafa al-Barghouti and the Third Way by Salam Fayyad and others. The Palestinian Authority was created as a transitional political institution that will facilitate the establishment of the Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. President Yasser Arafat was really hopeful that he could achieve Palestinian independence through this peaceful settlement. However, the Palestinian Authority 20 years later remains the Palestinian National Authority and did not develop into an independent Palestinian state, mainly because of the Israeli restrictions and the Israeli lies and deception. Next. Next. Within the, to better understand the political layout, within the Palestinian Authority, there is a special parliament for the West Bank and Gaza called the Palestinian Legislative Council. So the PLO, which is the executive political institution, is supposed to be the Palestinian government worldwide. Under the PLO, the Palestinian Authority is supposed to be the government in the West Bank and Gaza. The PNC, the Palestinian Parliament worldwide, is supposed to include members of parliament from the West Bank and Gaza in the name of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Unlike the PNC and the PLO, the Palestinian Authority had real elections for its president in 1996 and then in 2005. The Palestinian Legislative Council also had a real election for its members in 1996 and then in 2006. The PLO and the Palestinian National Council never had direct elections because it exists in the diaspora. So in the Palestinian Legislative Council, in the first round, 1996, Fatah was the dominant party. In the second round, in 2006, Hamas was elected as the dominant party, and a very interesting, complicated situation emerged because Hamas was not a member of the PLO and did not recognize the Oslo Accords and refused to be a part of the first Palestinian government under Yasser Arafat, but decided to join the Palestinian Legislative Council elections in 2006 and won decisively. They won about 64% of the parliament. So the president, who was from Fatah, President Mahmoud Abbas, elected in 2005, had to appoint a prime minister from Hamas in 2006. And a new complicated system emerged where the president is from one party, from the PLO, and the prime minister is from another party from outside the PLO. Okay, next. Okay, going back to the slide before this, of course, in these photos, we see Dr. Aziz Dweik, the Speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, who was detained by Israel for so many years after winning elections and leading the parliament. So the parliament itself became dysfunctional after many detentions by Israel in the West Bank, and by also assassination of other Palestinian members of parliament and ministers in Gaza. The one on the left is Dr. Ahmed Bahar, the late Dr. Ahmed Bahar, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament, who was assassinated very recently, a few weeks ago, in Gaza by the Israeli air attack. Okay. The Palestinian Authority government now is in a situation of disarray because since 2007, when political friction and security encounters took place in Gaza, Hamas took over power in Gaza, usurped the government that it was elected to lead in the first place. They usurped powers in Gaza in 2006. Fatah, meanwhile, usurped power in the West Bank, albeit being under direct military occupation from Israel. And President Abbas, for so many years, since 2007, had appointed several prime ministers without any endorsement from the Palestinian Legislative Council or Parliament. He appointed Dr. Salam Fayyad, then Dr. Ramil Hamdallah, then later Dr. Muhammad Shtayya, and others. Okay, next. Next. Finally, what's next? We have the deal of the century, which wanted to finish off the Palestinian issue politically. We will talk about it in future lectures. We have Al-Aqsa floods, a Palestinian resistance operation, which was supposed to bring the Palestinian issue back to relevance. We have an ongoing genocide in Gaza, and we have an ongoing resistance campaign by the Palestinian people. What is next will be decided by the developments of this period. Palestinian people are, of course, shifting their views politically, and the resistance is also dictating its terms in a way or another. So, how will things unfold in Palestine? This is left to both the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian resistance, but of course, external forces like the global world order and regional world order or regional orders also play a role in shaping the Palestinian future. Now, geopolitical developments we will not delve further in this, but geopolitical developments would include the many regional conflicts, including the Arab Spring and the failure of the Arab Spring, including the sectarian wars that took place, as well as the declining US hegemony in the region, in the Arab world and in the Middle East. Israel's recognition now internationally as an apartheid regime by groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, even Israeli groups themselves, and many international and United Nations related institutions. Israel's wars on Gaza and the genocide that is being conducted in Gaza, and the international efforts to isolate Israel through the ICJ and hopefully later through ICC, the uprisings that have been taking place in the West Bank, the resistance that has proven to be exceptional in Gaza since October the 7th. All these developments, in addition to the shift in popularity from Fatah to Hamas, the shift in demographic, demographic relevance from an ailing Palestinian political leadership led by the 88 years old Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas to a younger generation of Palestinian groups, as well as many other factors. Okay, next. In the next class, we will discuss many major issues in the Palestinian development. This will include the Palestinian refugees, their right of return, Jerusalem, and the challenges of Judaization, the challenge of illegal settlements, the blockade of Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, Jerusalem and its status, and other aspects. Now, concluding this class, we have seen that the Palestinians had life before Israel existed, have life in spite of the Israeli occupation, and will have life and after the end of the Israeli occupation. I end my presentation with this, and I welcome any questions or comments from our friends watching. What is the meaning of Zionist, Israel? The Zionist movement is the political movement that established Israel. Okay. I did not get the part on the population of Palestine. Zahke is asking before Nakba. I did not get the part on the population of Palestine before Nakba 1948, and upon migration of Ashkenazis and Khazar Jews increased to how much? Okay, I mentioned earlier that by the year 1917, the percentage of Jews in Palestine was very, very minimal. I, in fact, highlighted one of the statistics, which says that in 1918, there were only 55,000 Jews in Palestine. Many of them were new migrants since 1880, but some were original, Jewish communities that lived in Palestine over the centuries. In the 30 years of British occupation, the Jewish population increased from 55,000 up to almost 500,000. To be exact, there were 608,000 Jews in Palestine at the end of the British occupation. This is about 33% of the population of Palestine. However, this still does not give them right to steal 80% of Palestine just because their numbers increased from 55,000 to 600,000. Okay. UH is asking, sir, I have a question from the last lecture. Okay, please explain. Left, right, and central Zionism. Is this ideology divided also is Zionism ideology not having links with religion and Judaism? Okay, this is a question from the previous lecture. I mentioned in the previous lecture that the whole idea of Israel was based on a new fascist ideology that emerged in Europe. The Jewish people were persecuted in Europe by the European imperialist regimes, and these Jewish Europeans started to think of emancipation, of solutions. Many of them thought the best way is to blend with the local community. Some thought to immigrate to the new world, to America, Australia, and Canada is the solution. But some thought of a different idea. They thought of creating a Jewish-only state. So proposals started to come up. One interesting proposal was a Jewish state in the Soviet Union, in Russia. There's a small entity called Birobidzhan, which was in a way designed as a Jewish state. Another proposal was having an independent Jewish state in historical Palestine. Herzl designed the whole idea of a Jewish state in his book, the Judenstaat, or the Jewish state. Later on, the World Zionist Organization started to think of options. Eventually, Palestine was one of these options. Zionism is the driving force. It's the ideology that encouraged the Jews to organize politically as an ultra-nationalist movement. So they started to see themselves as a political movement. They started to see themselves as one nation, even though the Jewish people have never been one nation. The Jewish people who are scattered across the world, the Ashkenazis in Europe, the Sephardim in North Africa, the Mazrahim in the East and in Arab countries, they have many differences. Even if they all can claim to have some genetic links to the Israelites of the ancient time, these communities in the 19th century had so many differences, maybe more differences than similarities, except, of course, for religion. So Zionism as a political movement used religion. They decided to take the religious scriptures and to create new ideas, including a political state for the Jewish people in Palestine. To many Orthodox Jews, it is actually haram to have an independent Jewish state. Many of them still believe so. But to the Zionist movement, no, the solution was creating a political entity for the Jewish people. Now, Zionist ideology started as a right-wing ideology, but over the years, there were many reviews. Some took a socialist approach, or even interestingly, a communist approach to Zionism. And they identified with the Soviet Union, with the Eastern Bloc, etc. Of course, Zionism itself was, in a way, a social nationalist ideology. I think not very different from Nazism. But new streams of ideology emerged. Ideas of people like Zeev Jabotinsky, the father of the Zionist revisionist, Zionist group. They started to think of, a more extreme version of Zionism. Terrorist groups like Ergon and Stern emerged and started to push for a right-wing version of Zionism. Since Israel was created in 1948 all the way until the late 1970s, it was the left-wing Zionist groups that were in charge. But eventually Menachem Begin and Likud emerged as another version of right-wing Zionism. So Zionism, if this is the spectrum of political life, Zionism was already on the left. Zionism was already on the right. Some new versions of Zionism started to push it further to the right. Today, in the last 2 decades in particular, Israel has been run by extreme right-wing movements, and there are new religious Zionist ideologies and political parties which are way more right-wing and way more extremist than all former Zionist manifestations. So, to cut it short, Zionism is a right-wing ideology. It's an ultra-nationalist ideology. Nationalism is usually right-wing. But for certain periods of time, there were some socialist and left-wing ideas within the Zionist movement. In recent years, we only see right-wing Zionist manifestations. Of course, within Israel itself, there is a very, very small movement that's trying to go beyond Zionism. We might be able to call them post-Zionism, but they are very, insignificant within the Israeli political spectrum. Okay, next. Nino Pereira is asking about how much does the disarray in the Palestinian government contribute to the distrust of Israel and the Palestinian acceptance of Israel as an acceptable entity? Actually, it's not important to have Israel accepting the Palestinian side, because if you watched our lectures, the first and second lecture, probably this lecture as well, you will realize that the presenter of these lectures does not believe Israel has a right to exist in the first place. Israel is an illegal entity that was created upon a process of ethnic cleansing. It dismantled the Palestinian society and Palestinian life, forced out 900,000 Palestinians, about two-thirds of the Palestinian population, from their homes, and created a mythical regime based upon lies and some, of course, half facts. So the state of Israel shouldn't have existed in the first place, but it existed for 75 years as, of course, a political reality. And now the Palestinians are working hard to dismantle this apartheid regime that has been imposed with the help of the colonial powers upon the Palestinian life. Of course, the Palestinians have some political differences, disagreements, different ways and means of resisting Israeli occupation. But one thing that almost every Palestinian agrees on is that Israel should be dismantled as an apartheid occupation colonial project in Palestine. Yes, some of them say we will go for a political settlement in the West Bank and Gaza, but deep down, be rest assured that all of the Palestinians will eventually work on the dismantlement of the Zionist occupation in Palestine. Because look at the logos that we exhibited just now of the PLO or Fatah. You see historical Palestine. Yes, the Palestinians are weak now, and the Zionist colonial occupation is powerful, but the powerful doesn't remain powerful forever. The weak doesn't stay weak forever, and the dynamics change. Okay, next. Mariam Zakia is asking, do the Palestinians that live in Israel as Israeli nationals get their citizenship through naturalization or any other method? And how are they treated as second-class citizens, West Bank citizens, I mean? Okay. Again, if you remember, we had a slide that showed the Palestinian demographics. Inside Israel, there are about 1.5 to 1.7 Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have Israeli citizenship, identity cards, and passports. These people in the first 2 decades were not accepted as equal citizens. They were subject to military rule and they were persecuted like other Palestinians, but they remained. So Israel could not get rid of them. And in fact, Israeli political elite thought that, having some Palestinians in our new state would help us market ourselves as a so-called democracy. So these people were granted citizenship eventually, and they started to organize politically. Maybe we should have a special session in the future to talk about the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have political parties, they have the different ideologies, communist, socialist, Arab nationalist, and Islamist groups within the Palestinian society under Israel. But these people are second-class citizens. That's why people like Ben White have documented actually the apartheid policies against these Palestinians in a book called Palestinians in Israel, I think, and another book called Israeli Apartheid. As for the Palestinians in the West Bank, they don't have Israeli citizenship. They don't have Israeli identity cards. They are subject to military rule by the Israeli occupation power, and they don't vote in elections. They don't join Israeli political institutions. They don't have freedom of travel inside Israel and within the West Bank itself. So that's another form of apartheid. That's like the next level of apartheid, a worse case of apartheid in the West Bank, worse than that inside Israel. Okay, Azra Mumtaz, what is the role of Palestinian police, and when IOF is does demolish homes or schools in the West Bank, we don't see them. Okay, it's important to note that after the Oslo Accord and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian civilian forces and security forces were allowed only in certain areas. So the West Bank was divided into three areas. Area A, under full Palestinian civilian administration, and Palestinian police can operate in Area A. These are very small territories that include big Palestinian cities like Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, and most parts of Hebron. Area B are Palestinian areas which are supposed to be handed over to the Palestinian Authority in the future, but Israel never delivered them, where the Palestinian administration, civilian administration, is Palestinian, but security administration falls under Israel. Area C, which is a large chunk of the West Bank, is under both Israeli security and civilian administration. Palestinian police do not exist in Area C and B. So when Israel goes into Jerusalem, Israel refuses to give any parts of Jerusalem to the Palestinian Authority. When Israeli tanks and bulldozers go to demolish homes in Jerusalem, there are no Palestinian security forces or police or whatsoever. There is a direct military rule by Israel. So they commit all those atrocities under the subjects of their military rule, which is actually a violation of international conventions, including the Geneva Convention. As for the Area A, where Palestinian police exist, the Palestinian Authority is to a large extent toothless. If Israeli military decides to go into Area A anytime, they go, and the Palestinian police and Palestinian Authority in the West Bank usually closes an eye, because they are really toothless. And when President Abbas decided to take the peace process as the only way to liberate Palestine, it became very clear that Israel, using its powers and illegal occupation and fascist mentality, can do anything to the Palestinians anywhere in Area A, B, or C. Okay. Okay, Nino Pereira again is asking a question. He watched the first one, not the second one. I suggest that you watch the second lecture, because it deals with Zionism and the Zionist regime. It is a political reality that the Palestinians and their allies are working very hard to dismantle. I did not say it's a mythical regime. I said it's a political reality that was built upon lies, deception, and terror. Now, the difference between the two groups within the Palestinian context, if you mean the Palestinian context, is of course ideological, political, and now unfortunately geographical. But the difference between the Palestinian and the Israeli side, that will require you to watch the whole series. Okay, moving on. Okay, according to our operations room in the Hashim Sani Center, we have completed this session. Questions hopefully were answered, and I personally enjoyed this discussion, and I hope if you have more questions or comments, you can share it with me, either directly to me or through the WhatsApp group of our class. Please join us in the remaining sessions of this presentation on the Palestinian struggle, Israeli colonialism, and the Palestinian struggle, past, present, and future. Thank you very much for attending and listening. Thank you for your feedback and questions. And thank you, Mustafa, in the operations room, for making this video possible. And I hope that you can raise your questions, comments on the next discussion early, so that I can adjust my presentation to answer your questions as much as possible in the remaining 2 lectures. Thank you very much. I pray that today's discussion was was helpful to understand the developments of the Palestinian issue, and I pray that when we have our next lecture next week, the genocide in Gaza will be over. Thank you.